I was thinking about this analogy earlier. When you watch a master chess player at work, there is this incredible illusion of like total unyielding control.
Oh, absolutely. It's mesmerizing.
Right. Every single piece is moved with this absolute mathematical precision. You sacrifice a pawn to open a lane, you maneuver a knight to pin a bishop, and then boom, checkmate in 4 moves.
It feels entirely inevitable when you watch it play out.
Exactly. It's clean, it's logical, and it's perfectly contained within this 64 square grid.
Which is, I mean, it really is the perfect equation. And as human beings, especially, those of us who study business or economics, we fundamentally crave that kind of deterministic thinking.
We really
We
do.
want a world where action A guarantees reaction B. It's deeply comforting to believe that if you just build the right model, the universe is just going to comply.
But then, you walk into a Fortune 500 boardroom and suddenly you realize the chessboard is, well, it's on fire.
Right, completely up in flames.
The pieces are constantly changing shape while you're holding them. The board itself is spinning around, and half the people sitting at the table have decided they're playing a high-stakes game of poker instead of chess.
That is honestly perhaps the most accurate description of top-tier management I have ever heard.
Well, thank you.
No, I mean it. It's the absolute definition of a dynamic, complex system. It's where that deep human desire for the illusion of control just slams headfirst into the messy reality of market chaos.
And that chaos is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to your custom deep dive. Today we are going on a mission to decode this elusive, fiery chessboard we call strategy.
And it is a massive topic.
It really is. You are essentially taking an advanced masterclass right now. Our goal isn't just to, memorize some buzzwords. We're going to cut through the endless layers of corporate jargon, understand what actually drives a multinational business forward, and this is the big one, answer a question that makes a lot of people in corner offices very nervous.
Extremely nervous.
Right. Do the people sitting at the very top of the corporate ladder, the ones pulling down $20 million salaries, actually make a tangible difference to the bottom line? Or are they just, highly paid figureheads taking credit for the wind in their sails?
And we have a phenomenal, highly rigorous stack of sources to help you figure this out today.
We really do.
Yeah, this isn't just pop business psychology. We are looking at the foundational architecture of how businesses actually operate.
So we're pulling from a fascinating mix today. We've got a real university examination paper on advanced corporate strategy, which includes this highly practical, complex consulting scenario for a multinational conglomerate called the Asden Group.
That one is a great real-world application.
Definitely. We also have highly detailed lecture slides breaking down the mechanical frameworks of strategy. We're looking at a classic business article that challenges you to summarize an entire corporate strategy in just 35 words.
Which is much harder than it sounds.
Oh, I believe it. We're also pulling from the legendary management thinker Henry Mintzberg on his famous 5 Ps of strategy. And perhaps most intriguingly, we have a dense, highly controversial academic paper titled, "Does Corporate Strategy Matter?"
Which is a question that actually sent shockwaves through the entire discipline of strategic management when researchers first started aggressively crunching the empirical data. I mean, this was back in the early 1990s.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even begin to figure out if corporate strategy actually works mathematically, or, if the C-suite is earning those massive paychecks, we kind of have to figure out what strategy actually is.
Right, the definition itself.
Yeah. And looking through your sources, it seems like business leaders have been suffering from this massive multi-decade identity crisis. Like, they borrowed this term from the military, but nobody seems to agree on how it actually translates to a modern office building.
Well, the origins of the word strategy are, of course, inherently militaristic. Our lecture slides point out that dictionaries typically define it in terms of warfare, like generals and armies.
Exactly. The Greek word strategos, meaning generalship. When you look at Sun Tzu's The Art of War or, Karl von Clausewitz, the fundamental questions were always about survival and conquest.
Right.
Why do adversaries with inferior resources sometimes win? When do you appease an enemy versus when do you just confront them head on? What degree of resource superiority actually guarantees a successful campaign?
Which, you have to admit, translates pretty seamlessly into the cutthroat business world. I mean, you have functional specialization, rigid chains of command, line and staff systems, intelligence gathering on competitors. It's basically corporate warfare.
It is, because every business is formed for a specific purpose, usually maximizing shareholder value or profit. And to stay ahead of the competition, you have to deliberately plan your allocation of finite resources.
Make a battle plan.
Exactly. But when business academics tried to codify what that plan actually looked like in a corporate setting, the discipline just fractured completely.
Oh, yeah. In 1954, Peter Drucker framed it as a pattern of activities to adapt resources to environmental changes. Then, a few years later, Alfred Chandler argued it was strictly about setting basic long-term goals.
So, totally different angles.
Completely. And then, by 1996, Michael Porter revolutionized the field by defining strategy as deliberately choosing a different set of activities to deliver a unique mix of value. He famously argued that operational effectiveness, just being better or faster than the other guy, is not strategy.
Wait, just being better isn't a strategy.
According to Porter, no. It's just a necessity. Strategy is about being fundamentally different.
It sounds like everyone is circling the exact same elephant, but touching completely different parts of it. One guy says it's a trunk, the other says it's a tail.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
Which brings us to the Harvard Business Review article about the 35-word challenge. This piece is brilliant because it exposes the practical consequences of this academic confusion.
It really does.
They state that the vast majority of executives, like the very people steering these massive corporate ships, cannot summarize their own company's strategy in 35 words or less.
And the more alarming point they make is that if the CEO can do it and you walk down the hall to ask their chief financial officer or their head of marketing for their 35 words,
You get totally different answers.
yes, you will get 3 completely different, often conflicting answers.
That is genuinely terrifying.
Mhm.
If the executive committee doesn't share a unified definition of where the company is going, how on earth is the middle management or the frontline staff supposed to know?
They don't. That's the problem.
The authors point out the sheer organizational friction this causes. You have these ambitious product managers saying, I worked 80-hour weeks for 6 months to get this new software initiative off the ground, and the board just shut it down because it doesn't fit the strategic vision.
Right. And they're thinking, why didn't anyone tell me what the vision was?
Exactly. Or you have salespeople out in the field asking, why are we discounting our services to win a massive bid for this particular client when we explicitly agreed at the retreat last year that this market segment was a low-margin waste of time?
What's fascinating here is the analogy the authors use to explain the mechanical solution to this exact chaos.
The iron filings, right?
Yes. They ask you to imagine a large corporation as a piece of paper scattered with 10,000 tiny iron filings. Each of those filings represents a single employee.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Without a clearly articulated strategy, those filings are just pointing in 10,000 different directions. They're bumping into each other. They're pursuing contradictory initiatives. It is just pure organizational noise.
But if you pass a powerful magnet over that piece of paper...
They all instantly, violently snap into perfect alignment.
Wow.
The magnet is a well-understood, clearly articulated statement of strategy. It doesn't tell the employee exactly how to do their job. It isn't a micromanagement tool.
Right, it's not a step-by-step manual.
Instead, it aligns behavior. It provides a universal heuristic so that everyone in the organization, from the C-suite all the way down to the call center, can make individual, localized choices that naturally reinforce one another.
It essentially renders those 10,000 employees exponentially more effective because that friction is just gone.
Precisely.
And the gold standard example they pull from the real world to demonstrate this is Edward Jones, the financial brokerage firm.
A fantastic example.
Their strategy statement is exactly 35 words. I actually want to read it in full because when you break it down, it's an absolute masterclass in telling people what not to do.
Go for it.
Okay, here it is. Grow to 17,000 financial advisors by 2012 by offering trusted and convenient face-to-face financial advice to conservative individual investors who delegate their financial decisions through a national network of one financial advisor offices.
Let's unpack the sheer density of information in that single sentence, because this is what a real strategy looks like. It is defined by its boundaries. First, it tells you exactly who the customer is. Conservative individual investors who delegate. So if an Edward Jones advisor is at a cocktail party and meets this hyper-aggressive day trader looking for a platform to execute rapid-fire, high-risk options trades,
the advisor instantly knows this is not our customer.
Exactly. They don't waste time trying to build a product for them.
Right, and it tells you exactly how they deliver their unique value. Face-to-face, convenient, one financial advisor offices.
That part is crucial.
So if an ambitious regional manager suggests, Hey, we can save $50 million a year in real estate overhead if we close all these tiny local offices and build one massive centralized call center in the Midwest. The strategy acts as the magnet.
It instantly says no.
Yeah, that idea contradicts the face-to-face and one advisor office mandate. The debate is over before it even begins.
The power of a 35-word strategy is that it makes those daily operational trade-offs incredibly obvious. But, we have to be careful here because as much as business leaders love the elegant simplicity of a single sentence on a laminated card, human organizations are rarely that neat.
Fair point. People are messy.
Exactly. And this is where Henry Mintzberg steps in. He looked at the field and essentially said, stop trying to force this complex organism into a single box. In 1987, he published his framework on the 5 Ps of strategy.
Because he argued that we need multiple simultaneous definitions to actually capture what a firm is doing, right?
Right, because human nature demands a single, clean definition, but the reality of strategic management is far too messy for that.
Okay, let's unpack these 5 Ps because this completely changes how you view corporate behavior. The first P is strategy as plan. Now, this feels like the Edward Jones example. It's the most traditional orthodox view, right?
Yes, strategy as plan aligns perfectly with those Chandler and Drucker definitions we discussed earlier. It views strategy as a consciously intended course of action.
A blueprint.
Exactly. It's a guideline made in advance of the actions to which it applies, and it's developed purposefully. It is conception preceding action.
Makes sense.
Whether it's a formal 200-page document drafted by expensive consultants or just a deeply held vision inside the founder's head, it is the intended path forward.
Simple enough. You plan to build a bridge, then you build the bridge. But the second P is where things get significantly more Machiavellian. Strategy as ploy.
Yes, the ploy.
Mintzberg describes this as a specific maneuver intended to outwit an opponent or competitor.
Mm-hmm.
And this source text uses this brilliant, kind of hilarious analogy of a kid trying to get over a fence.
Right. The fence itself isn't the actual objective. The kid uses the fence as a ploy to draw a neighborhood bully into a yard where a notoriously aggressive Doberman pinscher happens to be waiting.
So the strategy wasn't to climb the fence at all.
The strategy was the trap.
And when you map that onto the corporate world, I mean, it happens constantly.
Oh, constantly. Game theory is deeply embedded in corporate strategy. For example, a multinational corporation might publicly announce, with great fanfare, that they are acquiring hundreds of acres of land to dramatically expand their manufacturing plant capacity.
But they don't actually intend to build the plant.
Often, no. The real strategy is the threat of the plant. It's a ploy to flood the market with perceived future capacity, which artificially drives down future price expectations.
Oh, wow.
And that, in turn, discourages a smaller rival competitor from securing the funding to build their own new facility. Once the rival backs down, the larger corporation quietly sells the land.
That is so ruthless. The strategy was entirely deception.
You see this with strategic patent filings, aggressive early pricing models designed solely to bleed out startups, or even public threats of antitrust litigation just to stall a competitor's merger.
Okay, so we have plan and ploy, both of which require a very high degree of conscious intention, like somebody sitting in a room actively scheming.
Yes, very deliberate.
But the third P is strategy as pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where Mintzberg defines strategy as a consistency in behavior over time, whether it was consciously intended or not.
Correct.
The text gives the classic example of Henry Ford offering the Model T only in black for years, or Pablo Picasso painting exclusively in shades of blue during his blue period.
Exactly. Mintzberg argues that if you look at a firm's actions over a long enough timeline, you can deduce its true strategy based on the consistency of those actions.
Regardless of what they say they're doing.
Completely, regardless of what their glossy annual report or their official 35-word plan claims they're doing, actions speak louder than plans.
Now, I have to push back on this a little bit. Because if we define a pattern as a strategy, aren't we just dressing up dumb luck with fancy academic terminology?
What do you mean?
Like, if a company has no idea what it's doing, and they just stumble around blindly in the dark, and they accidentally find a highly profitable niche, their strategy wasn't finding the niche. They just got lucky, realized it worked, and then slapped the word strategy onto it in hindsight, so the CEO looks like a genius on the earnings call.
That is an incredibly astute pushback, actually, and it strikes at the heart of one of the most important debates in strategic management. To answer it, we have to look directly at the concepts from your lecture slides. The distinction between intended strategy, emergent strategy, and realized strategy.
Okay, break the mechanics of that down for me.
Right.
How does a pattern separate itself from pure luck?
Think of intended strategy as the rational analytical view. It is the grand plan formulated by the CEO and the board. It's those 35 words.
The pristine chessboard.
Yes, but as we know, the chessboard is on fire. Things rarely go exactly to plan. Competitors react unexpectedly, supply chains collapse, new technologies disrupt the market overnight. That is where emergent strategy comes into play. Emergent strategy argues that the most brilliant strategic shifts don't come from a boardroom. They emerge organically over time through everyday routines, activities, and localized problem solving.
Interesting.
The academic term for this is logical incrementalism.
Logical incrementalism. So it's the things a massive company just naturally does well day in and day out, compounding over time until it forms a massive competitive moat.
Yes. Let me give you the quintessential example that's often discussed in business schools. In the 1960s, Honda wanted to enter the U.S. motorcycle market.
Okay.
Their intended strategy, their grand plan, was to compete with Harley-Davidson by selling big, heavy motorcycles to American men. But those big bikes kept breaking down on the American highways. They were failing.
Not a great start.
No. Meanwhile, the Honda executives who were living in Los Angeles were riding their tiny 50cc Super Cub delivery bikes around town just to run errands. And people kept stopping them, asking where they could buy those little bikes.
Because they were cheap, reliable, and completely different from a massive Harley.
Exactly. So Honda pivoted. They started selling the Super Cubs through sporting goods stores. It was a massive, unprecedented success that completely redefined the U.S. motorcycle market.
Wow.
That was an emergent strategy. It came from the ground up, from localized learning and adaptation. Honda's management was smart enough to recognize the pattern, lean into it, and formalize it.
So they embraced the luck, basically.
Right. And the intersection of what a company intended to do and the emergent patterns they adapted to along the way results in the third concept, realized strategy. This is the actual historical strategy the firm ends up following in practice.
So to summarize that for you, if you're listening, the intended strategy is the beautiful brochure you hand to investors. The emergent strategy is what your mid-level managers actually figure out how to do on a Tuesday to hit their quotas. And the realized strategy is what the business historians write about 10 years later.
Precisely. It is a continuous loop of planning and learning. Now, just to round out Mintzberg's 5 Ps, we have position and perspective. Strategy as position is about where the firm locates itself in the external environment.
Like finding your niche.
Yes, it is the match between the internal resources of the firm and the external market demands. Are you the low-cost provider? Are you the luxury boutique? It is purely relational.
And strategy is perspective.
This one is the deepest, probably the most philosophical of the 5. It views strategy not as an external position, but as an ingrained collective way of perceiving the world, a firm's worldview or paradigm.
How so?
Well, Mintzberg argues that every strategy is ultimately an invention. It is a figment of human imagination that no one has ever physically touched or seen. A strategy only possesses actual power because the members of the firm share this perspective, uniting them through culture, ideology, and shared belief.
Oh, that circles right back to the magnet and the iron filings. The shared perspective is the magnetic field. Without the shared perspective, those 35 words are just ink on a page.
Exactly. You nailed it. And Mintzberg's critical takeaway is that these 5 Ps are not mutually exclusive. In fact, a sophisticated company will utilize all of them simultaneously.
They juggle all 5.
Yeah. They'll execute a formal plan, utilize a ploy against a specific competitor, develop an organic pattern in a new market, ruthlessly defend their position in a legacy market, all while maintaining a unifying perspective that holds the culture together.
Okay, so we've established what strategy actually is. On a fundamental level, we've mapped the DNA. But now we need to elevate this. We need to see how this operates, not just for a single product line, but at the absolute highest echelons of a multi-business corporation.
The macro level.
Right. Because, look, managing the strategy for a single lemonade stand is hard enough.
Right.
But managing a massive global conglomerate that owns a lemonade stand, a shoe factory in Vietnam, a commercial real estate portfolio, and an experimental AI startup, that is an entirely different intellectual sport.
It is, and this distinction is absolutely foundational. Your lecture slides draw a very thick, bold line between 2 concepts, business strategy and corporate strategy. And for an audience following advanced business mechanics, this is where the theoretical rubber really meets the road.
Right, because I think a lot of people, they use those terms interchangeably, but they're answering fundamentally different questions.
Completely different questions. Business strategy, which is often referred to as competitive strategy, is typically the domain of middle-level managers and divisional heads.
Okay.
It focuses on a single strategic business unit, or SBU. Its entire goal is to gain a competitive advantage within one specific market.
So how does our specific lemonade stand beat the lemonade stand across the street?
Exactly. Do we compete on price, or do we use organic lemons and compete on quality?
But corporate strategy is playing on a much higher board.
Yes. Corporate strategy is the exclusive domain of top management. The CEO, the board of directors, the executive committee, it focuses on the aggregate organization. And its primary goal is not just competitive advantage for one unit, but achieving corporate advantage across the whole portfolio.
Corporate advantage. See, I hear a term like that, and my instinct is to immediately write it off as a meaningless buzzword invented by management consultants to justify, a seven-figure retainer. What is the actual mechanical definition of corporate advantage?
The slides reference a foundational 1998 definition by Collis and Montgomery. Corporate advantage is the overall measurable value that a corporation generates strictly through the parent-subsidiary relationship.
Wait, say that again?
It's the mathematical proof that the corporate parent adds more value to each individual business unit than any rival parent could, and more value than those units could generate on their own.
So we're talking about synergy, real quantifiable synergy, the idea that the whole must be mathematically greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly.
Like, if the lemonade stand and the shoe factory operate as totally independent, standalone entities, maybe they generate $10 million in profit each, $20 million total. But if they're acquired by the same corporate parent, they need to somehow generate $25 million together.
Yes, there has to be a premium.
Because if they don't, the corporate parent is just this parasite extracting overhead fees.
Right. That is the exact metric. If the collective portfolio is not worth more together under one parent, then according to strategic theory, the conglomerate should be broken up and sold off to unlock shareholder value.
Wow. So the pressure is really on the parent company.
Huge pressure. Top management is tasked with achieving this corporate advantage by deciding the long-term direction of the firm, deciding the scope of activities like what industries do we even want to be in, and ruthlessly reallocating capital across the whole portfolio.
To make this incredibly real and tactile for you, let's dive into the actual university exam paper included in your sources. There's a specific high-level scenario here that asks the student to step into the shoes of a top-tier consultant.
Yes, the Asden Group scenario.
Right. The prompt states, you have been engaged as a consultant to Asden Group to assess its portfolio and recommend what businesses to either invest in or divest. Using the BCG growth matrix, discuss the various options.
The BCG growth matrix is perhaps the most famous portfolio management tool in history. It was created by the Boston Consulting Group in 1970.
Hence the BCG.
Exactly. It's a brilliant visual framework designed specifically to help these massive corporate parents visualize where their cash is coming from and where it needs to go.
Okay, paint a picture of this matrix for us.
Imagine a simple grid with 4 squares. On the vertical axis, you are measuring the market's growth rate.
Okay.
So is the industry the specific subsidiary operates in exploding with new demand, or is it stagnant? Then on the horizontal axis, you're measuring the subsidiary's relative market share. Within that industry, are they the dominant gorilla or a minor player?
Okay, let's walk through the mechanics of managing these 4 squares, because these have some of the most famous nicknames in business history, and we'll apply it to our hypothetical Asden Group.
Sounds good. Let's start with the most glamorous quadrant. The top left square, high market growth, high market share. This is your star.
This is the dream scenario. You are the dominant apex player in an industry that is growing exponentially. Let's say Asden Group has a cutting-edge cloud computing division.
Exactly. The corporate strategy for a star is to consolidate or expand. Now, the counterintuitive thing about stars is that they often don't produce excess cash.
Why not?
Because the market is growing so incredibly fast, you have to constantly reinvest every dollar you make back into infrastructure, marketing, and R&D just to maintain your dominant market share against aggressive new competitors.
Oh, I see. Which means the corporate parent has to constantly feed the star with capital.
Correct.
But where do they get that capital? That brings us to the bottom left square. Low market growth, but high market share. You are still the dominant gorilla, but the pond has entirely stopped getting bigger. This is the cash cow.
The foundation of any stable conglomerate. Let's say Asden Group owns a legacy company that manufactures industrial steel pipes. The market isn't growing. Nobody's building revolutionary new steel pipes. But Asden has a massive 60% market share and incredible economies of scale.
So they're just printing money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because growth is low, they don't need to pour massive investments into R&D or new factories. The strategy here is strictly to harvest. The parent company strips the immense profits generated by the cash cow and reallocates that capital.
If I can translate this into a personal finance analogy, a cash cow is exactly like that reliable, boring, blue-chip dividend stock your grandfather bought in the 1980s.
That's a great way to put it.
It's not going to double in price overnight. It's not exciting. But it reliably pays the electric bill every single month. And as the corporate parent, your job is to take those dividends and invest them in the top right square of the matrix. High market growth, but low market share. This is the question mark.
The question mark is where the most agonizing corporate decisions are made. Let's say Asden Group has a tiny subsidiary developing artificial intelligence software. The AI market is exploding high growth, but Asden's division is currently a tiny player getting crushed by massive tech giants. Low market share.
It's the volatile crypto investment.
Yes!
The market is mooning. Everyone's talking about it.
Yeah.
You hold a tiny, obscure altcoin, and you have absolutely no idea if it's going to make you a billionaire or go to zero tomorrow.
That is the exact risk profile. The corporate strategy for a question mark requires a binary choice. You either aggressively invest, taking millions from your cash cow and pouring it into the AI division, hoping you can brute force it into becoming a star before the market matures, or you divest. You admit you can't win, you sell the division, and you stop the cash bleed. What you absolutely cannot do is underfund it and let it linger.
Because if you let it linger and the market growth eventually slows down, it drops into the saddest quadrant of all. The bottom right square, low market growth, low market share.
The dog. You have a tiny, unprofitable piece of a stagnant, dying market. Let's say Asden still owns a division that manufactures fax machines.
Ouch.
Yeah. The strategy here is brutal but necessary. Divest or liquidate. Sell the assets, fire the staff, and reallocate whatever capital you can salvage.
So when we act as the high-priced consultants for Asden Group, we aren't just drawing a chart. We are mapping out a highly volatile, highly political ecosystem. We have to walk into the boardroom and tell the manager of the steel pipe division, the guy generating all the actual profit, that we were taking his budget away and giving it to a bunch of 20-something AI developers who haven't turned a dime in profit yet.
Yes.
We take the cash from the cows, feed the stars, place massive strategic bets on the question marks, and ruthlessly put the dogs out to pasture.
And that political friction you just described is the essence of corporate strategy. Balancing that portfolio is a monumental task. But the BCG matrix only tells you where your cash is flowing. It doesn't tell you how your businesses should actually grow.
Right.
For that, the lecture slides introduce another foundational framework, the Ansoff matrix, created by Igor Ansoff in 1957.
Let's layer the Ansoff matrix over our Asden Group scenario. How does this dictate their growth vectors?
Well, the Ansoff matrix forces top management to evaluate growth through the lens of risk, measuring products against markets. Gives you four distinct pathways. The safest path is market penetration, selling your existing products to your existing markets.
You just aggressively market your steel pipes to try and steal a few more points of market share from your current competitors.
Exactly. Low risk, but low ceiling.
What's next?
The next step up the risk ladder is product development, creating new products for your existing markets. Asden Group knows their industrial clients well, so they invent a new, lighter type of pipe specifically for them. You leverage your existing customer relationships.
Then you have market development, right? Taking your existing products into new markets. Asden takes their standard steel pipes and starts trying to sell them in South America, where they have zero brand recognition or distribution networks.
Much riskier. But the final quadrant is where corporate boards actually lose sleep. Diversification. You attempt to launch completely new products into completely new markets. Asden decides to start manufacturing microchips in Taiwan.
That sounds like a recipe for absolute disaster.
Yeah.
Why would a company ever choose diversification?
Often it's out of sheer desperation. If their core markets are permanently declining, they have to reinvent themselves. But the failure rate is staggering because they have no core competencies to leverage. It requires immense capital and a tolerance for sustained losses.
So as the CEO, you're sitting there juggling the BCG matrix, trying to figure out which division gets the cash, while simultaneously forcing those divisions through the Ansoff matrix to figure out how they are allowed to grow.
It's a lot to manage.
But wait, The lecture slides introduce an entirely different dimension
Yeah.
here. Growth isn't the only lever a CEO can pull.
Correct. The slides outline overarching corporate directional strategies that encompass far more than just expansion. While shareholders, obsess over growth, a seasoned CEO knows that sometimes the correct strategic posture is a stability strategy.
Let's examine that. What does a stability strategy look like mechanically?
It can take a few forms. A no-change strategy is highly valid when a company has found a lucrative niche, the external environment is perfectly stable, and expanding would actually ruin their margins or trigger antitrust scrutiny.
Makes sense.
There is also a profit improvement strategy, where the top-line revenue is basically ignored, and the entire corporate focus shifts to internal efficiency, squeezing suppliers, automating factories, and brutally cutting costs to maximize the margin on existing sales. Or a CEO might implement a pause strategy. If they just spent 3 years aggressively acquiring competitors, the organization is likely suffering from acute integration fatigue. The CEO calls a halt to all new initiatives just to consolidate their gains, integrate the IT systems, and let the culture settle.
And on the flip side, what happens when the Asden Group realizes their entire business model is collapsing?
Then they must immediately pivot to retrenchment strategies. The most common is a turnaround, which usually involves bringing in a ruthless new management team to drastically slash overhead and refocus on core operations.
The classic corporate turnaround.
Exactly. If that fails, they move to divestment, spinning off entire divisions to raise desperately needed capital to save the core business. And the absolute final terminal option is liquidation, admitting defeat, shutting down operations entirely, and selling off the physical assets piece by piece to satisfy the creditors.
And the mind-bending reality is that a massive multinational conglomerate like GE or Disney is likely executing all of these strategies simultaneously across different divisions.
Oh, absolutely.
They are heavily subsidizing a question mark in Asia, running a turnaround on a dying dog in Europe, and executing a pause strategy in North America.
Precisely. The slides refer to this as a combination strategy, and it requires a level of executive processing power and emotional intelligence that is extraordinarily rare.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting, and this is kind of the crux of this entire deep dive. We have just spent, 20 minutes mapping out these incredibly elaborate matrices.
Yes, we have.
We've talked about intended versus emergent strategy. We've role-played as high-paid corporate executives, moving multi-billion-dollar business units around a fiery chessboard, agonizing over which stars to fund and which dogs to put down. When you look at the sheer mechanical complexity of this, it seems incredibly overwhelmingly obvious that corporate strategy is vital.
Right.
The CEO's job is essential. They are the puppet masters keeping the entire ecosystem from collapsing.
It certainly feels that way when you study the theoretical frameworks in a vacuum. It feels very logical.
But what if I told you that the actual hard mathematical data, the empirical evidence, suggests that everything we just talked about is entirely worthless?
We have finally arrived at the Bowman and Helfet paper.
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
We are entering the realm of the big heresy. Does corporate strategy actually matter? Because in 1991, a highly respected strategic management researcher named Richard Rumelt dropped an absolute bombshell in the academic and business world.
He really did.
He published a paper that essentially said the emperor has no clothes.
Rumelt utilized a highly complex statistical technique called variance decomposition to analyze the historical profitability of different firms. And his findings were so radical, they essentially threatened to invalidate the entire existence of corporate strategy as a legitimate academic discipline.
To understand why this caused such a massive panic, we need to dive into the mechanics of variance decomposition. The Bowman and Helfat paper goes into deep, deep statistical weeds, assuming the reader already has a PhD in econometrics. We need to elevate this concept and explain how it works without getting bogged down in Greek symbols.
Let's break it down conceptually. Variance decomposition, at its core, is a sophisticated form of ANOVA analysis of variance. Imagine you are looking at a massive spreadsheet containing the annual profit margins of thousands of different business units over 20 years.
Okay, I'm with you.
Some years, a business makes a 20% margin. Other years, it loses 5%. That fluctuation, that distance from the average baseline, is the total variance.
So the profit is bouncing up and down, and we want to know why.
Exactly. Variance decomposition is a statistical tool used to isolate and assign strict mathematical credit for why those profits fluctuated. A statistician creates a model with different variables to explain the variance.
Give me an example.
Well, was the massive profit jump in 2021 due to an industry effect? Meaning, did the entire tech sector just boom because of macroeconomic forces lifting all boats equally?
Right. If you're selling hand sanitizer in 2020, you look like a genius, but it's just an industry effect.
Precisely. Next, they isolate the business unit effect. This measures the specific, localized competitive advantage of that single entity. Does the manager of that specific factory just run an incredibly tight, efficient ship compared to their direct rivals?
Okay. Makes sense.
And finally, the statistician isolates the corporate effect. This is the variable that measures the impact of the corporate parent. This is the synergy. This is the value of the CEO, the BCG matrix allocation, the shared brand equity. The model calculates how much of the profit fluctuation is strictly due to the fact that this specific business unit is owned by this specific overarching conglomerate.
So Rommel builds this massive statistical model, runs the historical data through the variance decomposition algorithm, and looks at the results to see who actually gets the credit for corporate profitability. And what does the math tell him?
He found that the business unit effect was massive. Local competitive strategy was driving the lion's share of the results, explaining up to 47% of the variance in some models.
Wow, almost half.
Yeah. And the industry effect, just being in the right place at the right time, explained roughly 8% to 16% of the variance.
And the corporate effect, the slice of the pie credited to the visionary CEO, the grand 35-word strategy, the brilliant consultants reallocating capital.
According to Rummelt's 1991 variance components model,
Yeah.
the corporate effect was statistically indistinguishable from zero.
Zero. Rummelt's math gave corporate headquarters absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
Let's pause and truly absorb the implications of that, because the Bowman and Helfat paper explicitly points out the fallout. Based on Rummelt's work, prominent scholars started suggesting that the corporate effect simply does not exist.
Right.
Which implies that all the Ivy League MBA classes on corporate strategy, all those deeply serious executives sitting in boardrooms drawing Ansoff matrices, and the billions of dollars paid in executive compensation is a complete and total illusion.
It implies a deeply cynical view of corporate structures.
Yeah.
It suggests that equalization of returns happens at the corporate level, but not at the business level.
What does that mean in plain English?
What that means is that if the corporate effect is zero, being owned by the Walt Disney Company, or being owned by General Electric, or being owned by a random private equity firm, or operating as a completely independent standalone company, makes absolutely zero difference to the fundamental profitability of a specific business unit.
That is mind-bending. If I'm an institutional shareholder and I read Rummelt's study, I am calling the board and demanding the immediate firing of the entire C-suite.
You'd have a strong mathematical argument.
Right. Why on earth am I approving a $20 million compensation package for a CEO if the mathematical corporate effect is zero? The local middle managers at the specific factories are the ones generating all the actual variance. The corporate headquarters is just a massive, expensive parasite.
It was a profoundly provocative finding that resonated because it validated a lot of populist critiques of executive bloat. But this is exactly why Bowman and Helfat wrote their 2001 paper. They stepped back and said, wait a minute, this doesn't match reality. If the corporate effect is zero, why do conglomerates exist at all? Why haven't market forces destroyed them?
They realized there had to be a catch.
Yes, they realized that this revisionist view was based on a monumental flaw.
They came to save the CEOs. How did they debunk Rummelt's mathematical bombshell? Because you can't just argue with the math. You have to find a flaw in the methodology.
And they found a glaring one. Bowman and Helfat dug into how the data was originally selected and categorized. They pointed that Rummelt and another prominent researcher named Schmalensee, who published a highly influential study in 1985, made a critical methodological choice.
What was it?
They included single business firms in their data sets.
Wait, a single business firm? Like a company that only operates in one specific industry and doesn't own a portfolio of subsidiaries?
Yes.
But corporate strategy, by the very definitions we established with the BCG matrix, is entirely about managing a diverse portfolio of multiple businesses. I'm going to use an analogy here to highlight how absurd that is. Including single business firms in a statistical study designed to measure the effectiveness of corporate strategy is exactly like trying to measure the effectiveness of a marriage counselor. But half the people you include in your study are entirely single.
Mm.
Of course, the marriage effect is going to average out to zero.
That analogy perfectly captures the statistical distortion.
Yeah.
Think about how the model works. In a single business firm, it is mathematically impossible to separate the corporate effect from the business effect because the corporation is the business.
Right, they're the same thing.
There is no parent-subsidiary dynamic to measure. Because the statisticians couldn't separate them, many of these early studies simply defined the corporate effect as zero for those specific firms by default.
Wow.
So when you average the results across the entire data set, the massive proportion of single business firms aggressively drags the average estimated corporate effect down towards zero. It literally masks the reality of what multi-business conglomerates are doing.
So Rumeld Zero wasn't a revelation about corporate strategy at all. It was essentially a statistical hallucination caused by bad data sorting.
It was a severe methodological skew, yes. Bowman and Helfat highlight later more rigorous studies that corrected this exact flaw. A landmark 1996 study by Roper, Phillips, and Westphal utilized a much deeper database called Compostat and explicitly stripped out single business firms.
And what happened?
When they ran the exact same variance decomposition math on strictly multi-business firms, the only firms where corporate strategy actually applies the corporate effect didn't just appear, it leaped to 18%.
18%. That is a massive portion of the total variance.
And it gets even higher. McGahan and Porter, two titans in the field, conducted a study in 1998 where they created a specific subsample excluding single business firms, and their estimated corporate effect jumped from an already respectable 13.7% up to a staggering 23.7%.
Okay, so the marriage counselors actually work phenomenally well when you apply them to married couples. But the Bowman and Helfat paper goes even deeper into the data flaws, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about single business firms.
No, it was also about the foundational architecture of how researchers defined an industry in the first place.
Explain that, because it sounds like we're getting into the weeds again.
This is a highly technical point, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding how empirical research can unintentionally lie to us. These statistical studies rely on standard government classification systems, specifically Standard Industrial Classification Codes, or SIC codes.
Okay, SIC codes.
These are numerical codes used by the government to categorize every type of business activity. A two-digit SIC code represents a very broad macro category like manufacturing. A three-digit code is slightly more specific, and a four-digit code is highly granular, like manufacturing of electronic computers.
And how did something as mundane as government filing codes completely mess up the strategy math?
Because early researchers were limited by the computing power and data sets of the 1980s. They often used data from the Federal Trade Commission, or broad Compostat data, which grouped businesses into these very wide two-digit or three-digit categories.
So they were zooming out too far.
Let's trace the logic. If your statistical model defines an industry too broadly, you are unintentionally lumping many distinct, separate business units together into one giant, homogeneous business. This artificially reduces the number of distinct business units per firm in your spreadsheet, which, again, makes a diversified conglomerate look much more like a single business entity.
It's smoothing over the actual complexity of the portfolio. It's taking the BCG matrix and just coloring the whole thing gray.
Exactly. Chang and Singh proved this definitively in 1997. When they shifted their data source to a database called Trinet, which utilizes highly specific, granular four-digit SIC codes, they could finally see the true boundaries between a conglomerate's subsidiaries.
And let me guess, the numbers jumped again.
They did. When they ran the math using four-digit codes, the corporate effects they measured were 4 to 7 percentage points higher than when they used the broader three-digit codes. By defining businesses too broadly, the early researchers were accidentally capturing cross-business synergies, which is the literal definition of corporate strategy, and misattributing that value to the individual business units.
I want to make this concrete, using the Walt Disney Company example mentioned in the text, because this completely blew the lid off the methodology for me. Let's talk about how synergy gets hidden.
Perfect example. Let's look at Disney's core corporate strategy, which has historically been about leveraging their proprietary intellectual property, their cartoon characters, across a massive portfolio of different businesses.
Right. They make a hit movie, and then they immediately monetize that IP through theme park rides, cruise lines, merchandise, and video games. That cross-pollination is the corporate strategy.
Now imagine you are a researcher using broad three-digit SIC codes. Your data might lump theatrical film production and amusement parks into one giant category called entertainment.
Okay.
When a new movie comes out and theme park attendance surges because kids want to ride the new roller coaster based on the movie, your statistical model just sees the entertainment business unit generating massive profits.
Oh.
The model attributes that success entirely to the business unit effect, assuming the theme park manager is just a genius at running a park. It completely misses the fact that the corporate parent provided the synergy, the shared IP, the marketing, cross-collateralization that actually made that profit surge possible.
But when you switch to four-digit SIC codes, the model finally separates the movie studio from a theme park. It sees them as distinct entities, and suddenly it realizes, wait, these two separate businesses are both surging simultaneously. Why?
And the math finally recognizes the invisible hand of the corporate parent.
Yes. The four-digit code reveals the magnetic field we talked about earlier. It reveals the corporate advantage.
Okay, let's translate this 18% to 23.7% corporate effect into actual hard dollars for you. Because percentages on a theoretical variance chart are abstract, but cash is real, and we need to know if the C-suite is actually earning their keep. The Bowman and Helfat paper provides a hypothetical calculation that is genuinely staggering. Let's walk through their math because it grounds the theory in reality. Imagine a specific business unit operating within a larger corporate conglomerate. This unit has $500 million in assets.
Okay. $500 million in assets.
Now, based on the historical average distribution of returns in Rumelt's own original data, the mean return on assets for a business of this size is roughly 14%.
Okay, 14% on $500 million. So we have a baseline average annual profit of roughly $70 million, $67.7 million to be exact.
Now let's apply the variance. If the corporate effect, the influence of the CEO, the culture, the synergy, accounts for just 10% of the variance in that unit's profitability. And remember, based on the newer, corrected four-digit SIC code studies, 10% is actually a highly conservative estimate.
Right, they saw up to 23%.
But even at just 10%, that variance translates into a $16.7 million swing in pure bottom-line profit.
Wait, $16.7 million annually.
Yes. That is the mathematical difference between a business unit sitting at the very top of the industry profit distribution and an identical business unit sitting at the bottom, strictly and exclusively due to the influence of the corporate parent that owns it.
Wow.
$16.7 million is a full 25% of the total mean profit.
So a strong corporate strategy executed by a competent corporate parent is literally generating tens of millions of dollars out of thin air simply through alignment, shared resources, and intelligent portfolio management.
The math doesn't lie.
The executives are earning their paychecks. The strategic frameworks work. Corporate strategy absolutely, definitively matters.
The empirical evidence, once meticulously corrected for data and classification flaws, overwhelmingly proves that corporate effects are substantial and non-trivial. The resources, the capital allocation, and the overarching decisions made at the corporate headquarters affect competitive advantage just as much, if not more, than the operational decisions made at the business unit level.
But this brings us to a really fascinating pivot point in our deep dive, the human element. Because corporate effect is a very sterile, highly academic statistical term. If the corrected data proves that headquarters generates massive financial value, exactly who or what at headquarters is actually doing it?
That is the million-dollar question.
Are we measuring the impact of a fancy consultant's binder sitting on a shelf? Or are we measuring the impact of a specific human being?
That is the pivotal question that modern strategy researchers had to confront, because in theory, corporate influence acts as an umbrella for a lot of structural things. The scope of the firm, access to internal capital markets, historical brand equity, organizational structure. But how much of that 23% variance is driven by active strategic management?
Right.
How much of that is the CEO themselves pulling the levers?
And Bowman and Helfat reveal yet another massive blind spot in the strategy research community. The variance decomposition guys, Rumelt and his peers, completely ignored an entire pre-existing field of research called the leadership studies.
This is one of the most surprising and clarifying parts of the entire paper. Decades before Rumelt published his 1991 bombshell, organizational researchers were using very similar statistical techniques, but instead of trying to isolate abstract corporate effects, they were looking specifically at leadership effects.
Specifically, they were looking at CEO turnover, right? The ultimate variable. What happens when a new boss takes over the corner office?
Yes. Studies by Lieberson and O'Connor in 1972, Wiener in 1978, and Wiener and Mahoney in 1981. Instead of looking at a static snapshot of an industry, they looked at companies over long periods of time and measured the variance in profitability associated specifically with different chief executives taking office and implementing their unique visions.
And what were the numbers? Because if the CEO is just a figurehead riding the macroeconomic waves, the variance tied to their arrival should be zero.
The numbers were substantial, and they directly challenged the idea of executive impotence. Lieberson and O'Connor found a direct leadership effect of 14.5%.
That's huge.
It gets bigger. Other subsequent studies found effects ranging from 6% all the way up to an astonishing 44% of the variance in a firm's profitability.
The 44% variance based entirely on the specific human being sitting in the big chair. That implies that leadership is the single most volatile and impactful variable in the entire corporate ecosystem.
It does. And here is where we have to distinguish between two highly technical concepts the Bowman and Helfat paper brings up to reconcile these different studies. Stable effects versus transitory effects.
Okay, unpack that distinction for us, because this explains why the different researchers were getting such wildly different numbers.
The variance decomposition studies, the ones looking at industry, business, and corporate effects, mostly measured stable or fixed effects. That means they were looking at the average profitability of a corporation over a set time period, usually several years.
Right, smoothing it out.
Exactly. If a corporation's profits fluctuated wildly year by year, up 20% one year, down 15% the next, but average out to a standard industry norm number, the statistical model would smooth out those spikes. The stable corporate effect might look small because it's measuring the long-term inertia of the company.
It's smoothing out the roller coaster to find the baseline.
But the leadership studies were measuring transitory effects. By looking at the specific term in office of a CEO, they captured the dynamic year-over-year changes. They captured the shock to the system. They measured exactly what happens when a new leader comes in, blows up the old strategy, reallocates the BCG matrix, and redefines the 35 words.
So let's take a step back and connect the dots. What is the grand unified theory here?
The synthesis is that corporate strategy is not a static structural variable. The variance decomposition studies prove that the overarching corporate parent structurally matters. The leadership studies prove that the individual human beings running that parent actively drive the variance. As Bowman and Helfat state, top management discretion might be limited by massive macroeconomic factors totally out of their control, but a 14.5% to 44% leadership effect mathematically proves that individual leaders possess the power to drastically swing the bottom line.
Which means corporate strategy isn't just a Mintzberg plan sitting in a drawer gathering dust. It's a highly dynamic, human-driven process. The CEO's choices, how aggressively they manage the parent-subsidiary relationship, how quickly they recognize an emergent pattern and pivot, are empirically proven to generate tens of millions of dollars in value.
Exactly.
The fiery chessboard is real, and the person moving the pieces matters.
And to reinforce that, a subsequent study by McGann and Porter in 1999 proved that the transitory corporate effect, the strategic changes made year over year, is roughly equal in magnitude to the stable corporate effect and has a remarkably high rate of persistence.
Meaning a shock to the system, a brilliant new strategy implemented by a visionary CEO doesn't just bump the stock price for one quarter. It fundamentally reshapes the company's trajectory and continues to pay massive dividends for years after it's implemented.
Precisely. It alters the DNA of the firm.
This has been an incredibly dense, rewarding journey. Let's take a breath and summarize the arc of what we've uncovered today. We started by acknowledging the sheer difficulty of defining strategy, looking at the 35-word challenge, and how a crystal-clear statement acts as a powerful magnetic field to align 10,000 employees.
The iron filings.
Right. And we explored Mintzberg's 5 Ps, realizing that strategy isn't a monolith. It can be a conscious plan, a deceptive ploy, or an organic pattern that just emerges from the chaos of everyday operations.
From there, we mapped out the mechanical architecture of corporate advantage. We looked at how top management uses tools like the BCG and Ansoff matrices, not just to chart growth, but to actively manage the political and financial friction of balancing stars, cash cows, and question marks, constantly choosing between stability, expansion, and brutal retrenchment.
And finally, we tackled the big academic heresy. We looked at Rummelt's 1991 bombshell that claimed corporate strategy was mathematically worthless. And we watched Bowman and Helfat meticulously dismantle that claim.
They really took it apart.
By identifying the data flaws, stripping out single business firms, and demanding granular four-digit SIC codes, they mathematically proved that corporate headquarters drives massive profitability variance. And the leadership studies prove that the specific human beings at the helm are the true engines of that variance.
It is a profound empirical vindication of the entire strategic management field. But I want to leave you with a final, somewhat provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed today. We know that corporate leaders have massive financial impact. We know that clear, rigid, 35-word plans can drive incredible alignment.
Right.
But remember Mintzberg's concept of emergent strategy, the Honda Super Cub example. The brilliant patterns of success that just happen naturally from the bottom up, driven by frontline employees without the CEO ever planning them.
Right. The logical incrementalism. The reality that the market often knows better than the boardroom.
If emergent strategy is as historically valid as intended strategy, and if individual CEOs cause massive fluctuations in profitability based on their decisions, perhaps the ultimate corporate strategy isn't about sitting in a room and writing the perfect impenetrable 10-year plan at all.
Wait, really?
Think about it. In a world of extreme, escalating uncertainty where the external market is constantly shifting, a rigid 10-year plan might actually be a fatal liability.
So what is the alternative for the modern executive?
Perhaps the only corporate strategy that truly matters in the 21st century is building an organizational culture that acts as a fertile, flexible ground for brilliant patterns to emerge from the bottom up.
Like planting a garden instead of building a machine.
Beautifully said. And then hiring highly adaptable, intellectually humble leaders who don't just dictate from the top down, but who know exactly when to recognize an emergent pattern, abandon their ego, capitalize on the new reality, and turn it into the firm's new realized strategy. The best leaders of the future might not be the ones who write the best plans. They might simply be the ones who cultivate the best patterns.
That is a phenomenal paradigm-shifting takeaway. We started this deep dive by talking about the illusion of the pristine chessboard and the terrifying reality of the boardroom where the board is on fire and the pieces are constantly changing shape. What we've learned today is that corporate strategy isn't about perfectly predicting the next 4 moves to force a mathematical checkmate.
No, it's not.
It's about being the person in the room who can look at the chaos, find the magnetic true north, and align the iron filings so that no matter how violently the board spins, the entire company is moving forward together. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive. We will catch you next time.